Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to my public accountability meeting for North Yorkshire Police. I am Commissioner Zoe and I will be chairing this meeting. Welcome to everyone present in the meeting in the virtual room. So we'll go to agenda item 1, which is attendance and apologies. There's a number of apologies today. So Elliot Foskett, John McFall, Simon Dennis, Jenny Newbury and Fiona Wynne. And just to note, that the minutes from the previous meeting are recorded and published onto our OPFCC website and can be accessed there. So, agenda item 3, questions from the public. We have some great questions today. So Simon, could you put them on the screen, please, and I'll read them out. Right, the first question's from Tim from Harrogate, and it's about safeguarding. The HMIC found that North Yorkshire Police had failed many young people in North Yorkshire. What work has been done on the cases highlighted by the HMIC to understand the full extent of that failing, particularly the physical or emotional damage or death incurred to those young people as a result of the failings? Although I can appreciate that many or officers have training around vulnerable child cases, is it more suited to and handled better by some officers with a disposition to those cases? Given the focus on violence towards women and girls and this inspection, is it now the time to have a specialist unit in each main area of the county, or to have to return to the PVPU? How much of a problem is silo working between agencies such as North Yorkshire Police, Social Services, CAFCAS and the Family Courts? Are there gaps to fall through? So Lindsay Butterfield, you're going to answer these questions, please.
Thank you, Commissioner, and I'll take them point by point if I can. So in relation to the first part of that question, the HMIC reviewed in excess of 70 cases from North Yorkshire Police, and each of those have subsequently been reviewed by our teams. Where any safeguarded measures were required, they were absolutely put in place with partners, and where investigations were required, again, they were commenced immediately. I think it's fair to say that there are very, very strong partnership working arrangements within North Yorkshire, and that was commented on by the Inspectorate. And I'm very grateful to the Safeguarding Children's Partnerships who have supported as we've taken these recommendations forward. I'd also just like to highlight that there are no instances of death that has occurred to young people as a result of the findings of that report. So hopefully that covers the first point. And sir, please feel free to come in if you've got anything further to add. In relation to the second point, there was a section within the report that talked about the skills and training of our officers. Very important to say that we have to balance our workforce in terms of the demands on them and the skills that they're required in order to undertake their roles. And we've been working really hard to make sure that our detectives have the right skills and capabilities to be able to safeguard children. And there are particular courses, without becoming too technical, for the purposes of this meeting, but there are some very particular courses for detectives in order to undertake child abuse or child neglect investigations. We've worked really hard to make sure officers undertaking those investigations have the right skill set. So we've got a comprehensive training plan, and once they've completed the course, there's then a requirement to complete a portfolio. We know that there were some gaps in that not all of our staff had completed their portfolios once they'd been on the course. And again, we are making significant improvements in those areas so that they have the skills from the training and are able to demonstrate their operational competence by completing their portfolios and making sure that they are signed off. Tim talks about a return to the PVPU. I think it's fair to say that our structures and our approach will remain under review and will be led by national best practice. But at the moment, our immediate attention is making sure that officers undertaking those investigations have the right skills to be able to best support children and young people in North Yorkshire. And the final point in relation to silo working, I've touched on the strength of the partnership approach here. That was commented on by the Inspectorate in a really positive way. Very, very strong relationships through the statutory Safeguarding Children's Partnerships. So within that, there are the 3 statutory partners, which is police, local authority and health. And we've worked really closely as a collective response to the police inspection. So I am confident that there are very strong partnership relations in place, and I would not describe silo working when it comes to those current arrangements. So confident that we are in a good place.
Thanks, Lindsay. Let's go to question 2. So this question is from Jane from Bentham, and it's about safeguarding again. Section 7 of the HMIC FRS report says the force allocates some investigations to officers without the right skills and experience. What developments have been made to put this right? Will you be apologising to victims for not using officers without the right skills and experience? Lindsay.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Jane, for your question. I'll start with the apology if I can. We have publicly apologised, the Chief has apologised to any victim that we may have failed as a result of our previous processes and systems. And the Chief Constable and the Deputy Chief Constable have been very open and honest about that. In relation to moving forward then, I've touched already on the specialist training and portfolios for our investigators, making sure that they are trained and accredited to deliver the best possible service to those children and young people. We've also worked really closely with the HMIC, with the College of Policing and other forces that are performing particularly well in this area to understand best practice and then bring that into North Yorkshire. And that's resulted in a revised crime allocation policy, making sure that the most serious crimes are allocated to investigators with those skills to be able to deliver the best possible service.
Thank you. Right, let's have question 3. This is from Jackie Gray, Councillor for Brompton by Sordon Parish, and it's about 101. Can the Commissioner please tell us when contacting 101 will be a simple call without a very long wait for someone to answer? Can she also tell us why we are not able to leave a message if the line is busy? And the same problems are found with the 111 service. Neither are really services that public have trust in. Well, that's a very good question, Jackie, that I do ask a lot. I'm going to hand over to Lindsay to answer this.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Jackie. I'm going to touch on some of the pressures and demand on our force control room when we come to the performance pack. But in relation to our 999 call handling and 101 call handling, we know that our answer times are still not acceptable. I'm hoping to be able to give some reassurance in today's meeting in terms of the plans and steps that have been taken over recent weeks and the improvements that we are starting to see. But I do completely appreciate it must be incredibly frustrating if you're left on hold waiting for your call to be answered. In terms of not being able to leave a message, so we don't have an answer phone facility, but what we do have is a callback option. So that allows callers to ask for a callback as a priority. So we find that that is the better option as opposed to an answer phone. People might leave information that's not relevant. We might need a little bit more information. So in order to streamline that process, we have the callback facility instead. So we'd encourage members of the public to use that function rather than having to wait, but also to explore some of the options available through our website now that there are more opportunities to report online. So hopefully 101 isn't the only option for people. If it is, please use the callback facility, but I would encourage people watching this meeting to explore the report online options as well. And I'm not sure I can comment on 111, Commissioner.
No, that's not in your remit. I do see that Tom's got a question. Tom, do you want to come in on that?
Well, it was just to come in and thank you, Lindsay, for that. Would it be possible to just explain a bit about the callback system? Because I know that when talking to the members of the public, sometimes they say, "Oh, well, it just didn't come up for me," and other times, I called it and it took forever to come back or whatever. So, but I know that the callback system only really kicks in if the waiting time is over a certain period of time. So I just wondered whether you can explain a bit more how that works so members of the public understand it, please.
Thank you, Tom. You're absolutely right. So that option is offered to anybody who is on hold for a set period of time. My understanding is that is 2 minutes, because 2 minutes is our target answer time. So if we go beyond that, my understanding is the callback option would then be offered. I will double check that while we're on the meeting and just confirm at the end, but that's how I understand it works currently.
Right, thank you very much. Can we have question 4 now, please? Right, so this is from John in Balby, and it's about 101 again. Is there any wonder North Yorkshire Police have performed so poorly in the recent published national statistics on time taken to answer 39 calls when the recruitment attracts applicants seeing the role as a sometimes very brief stopgap to become a PCSO or police officer? Humberside Police have a caveat that those recruited into the control room roles are unable to apply for internal vacancies for 4 years now, recently increased from 2 years. Have North Yorkshire Police considered this front-end adjustment to ease the situation? And the second part of the question is, this is resulting in a very high turnover of staff, a dwindling of experienced staff, and despite the best efforts and goodwill of those who have been in the role for some time, there is nothing in the way of recognition for this, little to no chance of advancement, and ever-increasing demand. Highly skilled emergency call takers also been expected to perform time-consuming yet necessary admin roles generated by the explosion of online reporting, given the understaffing of the phone lines. Surely a dedicated digital team to deal with these inquiries who are not public-facing could be set up to free up the call takers who, in the main, are in the job to help people in their hour of need, on the phone or using their communication skills, and not copy information from an online form onto the system. Lindsay.
Thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, John. In relation to the first point then, and looking to other forces for best practice, we have spoken with Humberside colleagues and we are exploring all options that are available to us. There are some challenges in relation to contracting individuals, resulting in them being unable to apply for internal vacancies. And there are some risks with that in that they may then apply elsewhere and we would lose them from the organisation altogether. So it does need to be a balancing act. And we are very much focusing our current activities around recruitment and making sure we've got the right number of resources in our customer contact centre to be able to answer that demand from the public. In relation to the second point, absolutely accepting our call takers are highly skilled and we would want them to be available to take incoming calls. Some of the work that we have coordinated more recently has been done to free them up so they are available to take incoming calls, and we've actually been bringing officers and staff into the control room environment to be able to process some of those admin roles that John has talked about. So one of the key intentions from the group that is managing and monitoring the control room at the moment is to reduce the burden on our call takers, to be able to share that workload with other officers and staff so that they are free to take as many incoming calls as possible. In relation to the point around a digital team, I think it's really important, Commissioner, to say there are two pieces of work at the moment that are ongoing. So there's the gold structures, so that oversight and scrutiny and support at an executive level. So there's a group chaired by myself at the moment overseeing some of that progress on our call handling, and we'll come to that in the performance pack. So there's the here and now, and what do we need to do immediately to be able to improve our performance. And then there's a longer term piece of work which has just been commissioned and started, looking at what is the future of our customer contact offer. And that may well include a digital team or a digital desk, but that's very much being scoped. And I think it's really important to say that whatever the future of customer contact looks like, it absolutely needs to be resourced effectively to make sure that we're able to process those queries in a really timely manner and give the best possible service to the public.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for asking those questions. And when people are watching out there and want additional questions, please contact us on social media. And there is part of the agenda later on that we can come back to those. OK, so we'll go on to agenda item 4, which is the North Yorkshire Police presentation. And I believe, Lindsay, over to you again, but also Mabs, you're coming in on this. And what I would ask, if it's possible, could you just include some examples where you can of how things have been embedded and put into place? Thank you very much. Over to you.
Just bear with me, Commissioner. I'll just try and share the presentation. There we go. Is that visible to colleagues? Yeah.
It is.
Just be mindful, I now can't see you, so if there are any questions, please just ask. Okay, so following our previous National Child Protection Inspection presentation to the Public Accountability meeting, the purpose of today's update is just reassurance in terms of the plans that we have in place and the progress that we're making in relation to them. So, contents of the presentation, background and context, what's going well, the issues that we still need to address, some opportunities as we see to be able to overcome those challenges, the aims and the opportunities that we are pursuing, and what we plan to achieve within the next 12 months. So just by way of background, our National Child Protection Inspection took place in November 2021. Draft version of that report was received in January of this year so that we could undertake factual accuracy checks, and that resulted in 10 recommendations to our organisation. 5 of those were for immediate attention, and 5 were to be progressed within the next 3 months. It's fair to say we worked immediately to address those recommendations and that the Chief Officer team have fully accepted the findings of the Inspectorate. So focusing today on some of the key recommendations and the work that we are undertaking in order to address them. So North Yorkshire Police is making progress in making sure officers obtain and record children's concerns and views, including noting their behaviour and demeanour. So the Inspectorate were critical that we had not embedded what is called voice of the child within our systems and processes, and that was being able to demonstrate that we could effectively obtain and record children's concerns and views when dealing with incidents where children were present or were witnesses. And so we have again worked with other forces, worked with the college and with the HMIC to understand who does that really well and how can we take that learning and embed it in North Yorkshire. And I'm really proud to say that we have rolled out Voice of the Child training between April and May to all of our front line. So all of our supervisors have had briefings and are rolling that out through their team. And that includes a really impactful video of a domestic incident that a child has witnessed and then picked up the telephone and called 999. So that opens up a discussion for the officers in relation to what they've observed and any actions that they may take now that they understand the impact of Voice of the Child. We've also designed and implemented a guide called Aware, and that was to help officers understand exactly how they should be making their observations and what they might be looking for when they're attending such incidents. With that then feeds through to a conversation in the training session about how that child presents and what any particular questions that we would ask of that child if we were the attending officers. Following that through then, the officers are then provided with some guidance on how to complete a public protection notice, which is the multi-agency pro forma that supports referrals onto other agencies. And within that, asked to capture the voice of the child based on what they've seen and the discussions that they've had. So specifically, officers are asked to think aware, and that includes the appearance of the child, the words that they might be using, any activity that they're undertaking or not undertaking while we're at that address or incident, the relationship between child and parent or child and adult within that house and anything within that that would cause us concerns, and the dynamics between that relationship. They're also asked to consider facial expressions, behaviour, body language and interaction of that child with their parent and carer, and to capture all of that information, submit that through on the public protection notice. And finally, officers are asked to write in the child's words, because actually that's really powerful. So some examples of that might be that mum drinks a lot of wine, that makes mum moody, she falls asleep and then I'm hungry. So using the child's words to describe the situation is actually very, very powerful. So that training has been rolled out to the front line. We have got in post a child protection inspection coordinator who's a member of police staff but with a very extensive safeguarding history, and that individual is now quality assuring and checking those forms that are being submitted by our front line. So we're undertaking at the moment checks of 20 forms per week. What that gives us the opportunity to feedback and praise where officers have submitted very, very good PPNs, and we are seeing some really good examples of that. but also to address with that individual and their line manager if the performer hasn't been used, for example, or if perhaps they've misunderstood some elements of it. So in the longer term, that will feed into our audit processes, but just in the very early stages, it's just ensuring that that's having the impact that it was designed to have. And I'm pleased to say we've got some really positive examples of where that's working well, as well as some very, very positive feedback from partners. And Commissioner, just for your, sorry,
Lindsay, may I just come in on that point in terms of what the Commissioner mentioned with regards to sort of the examples? So I've seen some examples come through to me in terms of what officers have completed with regards to the public protection notices. And as Lindsay has described there, you can see the quality of them with the comprehensive updates that have been provided by the officers. As part of a goal group and action plan, one of the things that we do for all the recommendations is quality assure the work now to make sure it's getting embedded. So there's lots of dip sampling going on in the background as we are rolling out the aware training, as we are rolling out the training around the PPN notices, and making sure we get the standard of referrals right to ensure that it's not just an isolated group of officers who are enhancing the completion of the forms, but it's actually embedded across the organisation. And from the initial work that we have done, the dip sampling we've done, it's very, very positive.
Can I just ask a further question on that, please? So we talk about well, sorry, Mabs, you talk about dip sampling and making sure it's quality and assured. That's the thing. It's all right doing it now, but how are we going to get assurance that it's going to carry on being done? That we can get that assurance that in a year's time it's still happening and that you're going to be looking at it.
Do you want me to pick it up? No, go on, I'll let you come back in. I'm happy to pick it up, I'll let you come back in.
Thank you. So, Commissioner, one of our successful resourcing bids as part of this year's financial uplift was for a safeguarding quality assurance team, and they will do exactly that. So there is a rolling audit process, not just this element, but actually a number of different areas across safeguarding, but that will provide the assurance that I believe you're seeking.
Thank you. Caroline.
Sorry,
Mabs.
No, just sorry, before Caroline comes in, if I may, just in addition to that, obviously we've talked about the quality assurance team as part of a performance governance framework that we brought in from a force performance meeting point of view, looking at vulnerability as a thematic. So we reviewed our approach on rape, domestic abuse, sexual offences, including offences against children in March. We're going to do that again in September, and this will be part of our governance framework, and the quality assurance team will feed into that governance framework.
Thank you. Caroline.
Thank you. I was just going to mention about the work and engagement of the Youth Commission to just enhance that work of the voice of the child. And I know that it's something that was explored at panel this morning. The Chief Constable had highlighted as well the opportunities that, while we're looking specifically here at NCPI kind of response and the wider opportunities this presents, that for officers having had this training, even attending, for a burglary, for example, being able to take on this kind of training and added skill set will prove beneficial as well to some of the wider sort of policing incidents that you attend. And then it was just to touch on adding on the Youth Commission as well. This should be a constant, that we've had this opportunity presented, and it will be something that will be ongoing as well. I think that's continued through the coordinator, isn't it? So that we're establishing, I suppose, feedback and making that sustainable as well. So it's always ongoing learning.
Yes, absolutely. And the Youth Commission have offered to help, not just with this recommendation, but actually a number of recommendations and to give some opinions and views from their perspective, which has been really, really helpful. Thank you, Commissioner. So that's in relation to voice of the child. So moving on, I can. Secondly, we are putting in place robust processes to review how well our control room staff perform in relation to officers attending incidents. So the specific ask from the HMIC FRS was we recommend North Yorkshire Police immediately reviews its processes regarding incidents relating to child protection, paying particular attention to how control room staff make decisions on officer response. And there were some examples cited by the inspectorate where we had downgraded incidents and therefore delayed our response to them. Clearly, that's not acceptable. So there is now a very robust process in place whereby call handlers cannot downgrade an incident without supervisors' advice and sign-off. And again, we're in the audit and the testing stage now in relation to that particular part of our response, but that's very, very positive. In addition, we are monitoring very closely how long it takes us to dispatch an officer to an incident and any disparity there might be across North Yorkshire and the City of York. So as the DCC has just alluded to, we now have a force performance meeting, and actually our dispatch times form part of that, where commanders are held to account for the performance of their teams in relation to responding to calls for service. We've also reviewed our call scripts. So they're the scripts that are provided to call handlers when they are processing those incoming calls, making sure that they are fit for purpose and that they also address the elements of the NCPI report that are relevant to them. So that's been reviewed. And any incidents that present a risk, so concern for safety, missing person, domestic abuse, for example, is automatically flagged to a supervisor within the control room, who is then able to give that quality assurance and perhaps any additional direction that might be needed, either to the call takers or to the dispatchers, just making sure that we are sending the right resource in a timely manner and that we are correctly identifying threat, risk and harm. Overlaying all of that then is a call monitoring process. So at the moment, this is undertaken by supervisors within the control room environment. They are monitoring live calls taken by their staff and completing a checklist to make sure that we are adhering to all of the key recommendations and the improvements that we've made and making sure that's really, really embedded. That then gives us the opportunity to either recognise the good work that is ongoing or to support those staff that may have additional training needs. But again, that's now embedded and taking place across all of the bands. If we have any immediate grade incidents that we are not able to resource, then they are flagged immediately to the force incident manager, and that's the inspector within the control room, and it would be their job to identify a resource to be able to attend that incident. So your immediate grades are typically your 999 calls for service. Very rarely are we in a position where we're not able to service those immediately with staff from that area. Where that does happen, and it does happen on occasion, it's making sure we've got that escalation process in place so that the control room inspector can direct resources to attend that particular incident and mitigate any harm that might be caused there. So lots of work ongoing within the control room. I think it links really nicely to the next slide, if I may move on. This talks about how we review and record incidents involving missing children, and in particular understanding why they go missing and completing those public protection notices robustly. So the inspectorate recommended that we immediately improve our missing children arrangements and practices. They found examples where incorrect gradings had been applied to children, which then had an impact on the response or the timeliness of the response that we gave. And I think this links really well with the slides we've just touched on, because actually the initial grading happens within the force control room. So there is a really strong link between how the call handlers and dispatchers grade those incidents right through to how our officers and staff then respond. So we have worked with colleagues on a national level to understand national best practice around missing person procedures, and we have refreshed and revised our internal procedure, making sure that missing children especially are risk assessed at the very earliest opportunity, and that any inquiries we make are overseen immediately by an inspector within our organisation. So that's been a key change to our policy. Details of missing children are now shared on a daily basis with the command senior leadership teams, so they understand who is missing within their area and they can assure themselves that appropriate resources have been allocated in order to locate those children. The piece of work that we are still on with is reviewing how we engage with children when they return from a missing episode, because that needs to come from a place of understanding why they've gone and what we need to do to prevent repeat episodes. So at the moment, that's making sure that we embed voice of the child within our return home interview, and that we then share that information across with key partners who've also got responsibilities to safeguard children and look for opportunities to prevent a repeat of that particular incident. So the information that is shared with us on the safe and well checks when those children do return home is shared across with local authority, children's social care, who work with us to make sure we can implement any referrals that might need to be made or any other solutions to prevent those children from going again. Technically, there are some challenges around our system that relies on national upgrades, but again, that's planned in for later in the year, so I don't think that's a huge issue. For us, it was more about making sure that we were consistent in the grading of those incidents and that we were deploying the right resource in a really timely manner in order to look for missing children. Are there any questions on that one before I move on?
I don't think so, Lindsay.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm slow to get my hand up there. Just coming back to the question around how robustly PPNs are being completed and how well that referral process then goes on. Can you just say something about what you're doing to make sure that is being undertaken really well and that process, please?
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. So I think it links back to the first slide in terms of embedding voice of the child and then the quality assurance of the PPN. So we're currently reviewing 20 a week to make sure that they are at the right standard and providing that feedback to officers. So those that are doing it really well, who are typically super users within the commands, but also those who perhaps haven't embedded their new training in their submissions, working with them and their line managers to understand why not and to put any additional support in place. So that's the current arrangements, and that links into the point around ongoing quality assurance and the quality assurance team that we now have in place as well. And
so you said that you're dip sampling 20 a week there. What kind of outcomes are you having from those samplings? Are you content that generally there's a really high standard, or are you finding that feedback needs to be given on a frequent basis?
No, it's really positive, Tom. We've had overwhelming positive results from that piece of work. The officers are really grateful for the guidance that they've been given. They find the pro forma really easy to use, and they're submitting the forms to a really high standard. I know DCC Hussain has seen a couple of those that have been sent to him as examples of excellent work, but overwhelming positive feedback in relation to that approach. And then super users within the command, so PCs and sergeants, are then supporting those in their team, making sure that they understand exactly what's required of them and that they're submitting through to the right standard first time.
Great, thank you. It would be really good, just from an assurance perspective, if it would be possible to share a summary of the numbers that have had feedback and the numbers that have been good. If we could get a summary kind of table of what the findings are from that sampling so far, that would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. I'll make sure that goes through the current structures then, and that'll feature on the next goal group agenda. Thank you. Okay, so the next one, which is slightly more complex, but we were making steps to work more closely with our safeguarding partners and reviewing the structure and practices of multi-agency risk management meetings, specifically about children at risk of exploitation. We recommend North Yorkshire Police immediately starts working more closely with its safeguarding partners and that it reviews the structure and practices of multi-agency risk management meetings. And the reason that I say this one is slightly more complex is because we're working across 2 local authorities, and at the moment we have very different processes in place. So the meeting structures within North Yorkshire are more complex. They span the geographic commands and also involve slightly different colleagues to the meeting structures that we have in York. So in order to make some progress in this area, I've met with the Director of Children's Social Care for York and North Yorkshire, and we've looked at how we can streamline the existing structures to try and bring some consistency. From a North Yorkshire Police perspective, some of the challenges that we have is that we have different ranks or different individuals attending those meetings. So we have some challenges there around consistency of attendance and also understanding of exploitation. So within the Harrogate Command at the moment, we are piloting a slightly new approach. So the Harrogate, well, each of the commands have what's called an expedite team, which is a proactive vulnerability safeguarding team. And the Harrogate team at the moment are focused purely on working with our safeguarding partners, looking at multi-agency management of risk around exploitation. So that means for Harrogate, as part of the pilot, they have a single point of contact from those multi-agency meetings that would then pick up any actions, work with partners to address any interventions that might need to be needed, take enforcement action against perpetrators, and then be able to feed that back into the relevant partnership. It's very early days for the pilot, but the feedback is very, very positive. Partners are finding that consistency in terms of the team and the individuals concerned is very helpful, helps us to build relationships. The staff on that team have had enhanced exploitation training, which again has been very well received and has supported their approach with the enhanced learning that they've got. And the intention, Commissioner, is that we will review that approach once it's been embedded for 6 to 9 months, with a view to then identifying that as really good practice and looking at how we can implement across North Yorkshire and the City of York. So there are some structural issues at a strategic level that I'm working through currently with the Directors of Children's Social Care to make sure our meeting structures are as streamlined as they can be and that we're making the most efficient use of everybody's time. But then within policing, it's looking at how do we make sure we get that consistency of approach and attendance in multi-agency meetings, and that those attending have a really good understanding of exploitation, how that may present, and how we can best safeguard some of those vulnerable children. So lots of work ongoing there. We are making progress, perhaps not as quickly as we are with some of the other recommendations, but it is a complex area of business. And again, just making sure that we are keyed in nationally with some best practice and that what we're doing is in line with that, as opposed to taking any other different approaches. And I think this one, again, links really nicely. There's the strong theme throughout of training, and I'll come on to the overarching work streams at the end. But North Yorkshire Police are allocating resource to help its child sexual exploitation team improve the understanding of child sexual exploitation, in particular improving staff awareness, knowledge and skills in this area of work. So currently we have a very small central missing and exploitation team. It's 4 officers in total. Not everybody within that team had the enhanced training around exploitation, so that's now being rectified. Every missing episode of a child is reviewed by the missing from home officers, looking from a proactive perspective of how can we prevent this reoccurring. And then supporting investigators within the CIDs and the investigation hubs across the commands with any investigations they may have on their caseload. So training for that central team was one of our key priorities, and that's been undertaken. In terms of developing the awareness and understanding of our wider workforce, we have worked really, really hard to put a face-to-face training day back into the rota for our frontline response teams predominantly. And then we've done that as a priority. So that will start on the 20th of September. They will have a training day built into their shift pattern. And we've started with them because they're the officers that will attend those incidents in the first instance. It's really important that they know what to look for, and perhaps just to be able to have that professional curiosity. Things might not always be as they first present. So just that increased awareness and understanding, which might prompt them just to ask another question and perhaps understand exactly what's going on within that household or at that location. So we are designing bespoke training, vulnerability training for our officers from the 20th of September onwards to be delivered. That will focus predominantly on the findings from our report, and it will be used to reinforce some of those key messages that have already been given to them. So this is not just an approach where we'll tell everybody once, it's actually how we reinforce that and build that into the training plan. In addition to that, there's then the enhanced training for the expedite team, which I've touched on already in Harrogate, and how that's working and giving that support across the partnerships, particularly in relation to the multi-agency child exploitation meetings. Taking that one step forward then, particularly with the expedite team, it's making sure that any perpetrators of exploitation, so any offenders, are allocated a detective inspector and a neighbourhood policing team lead, and that they have a very solid understanding of what's required of them in their role in order to design problem-solving plans that allow us to take enforcement action, if that's appropriate, or to develop the intelligence to support any policing activity. Making sure that we are then adopting those high-risk perpetrators in order to target them, or high-risk victims in order to take that additional safeguarding action that might be appropriate. And to do that, we've also engaged some national experts. So we're working with PACE, Parents Against Child Exploitation, and Commissioner, I believe that's been supported through your office, and hand in hand looking at some offers of, for example, trusted relationship training. So where we know we've got an issue in a particular locality, working with those experts from the voluntary sector to be able to support our response. And key workers from those organisations are also trialling being co-located with our expedite team as part of that pilot. So we're looking at having the dedicated specialist social worker as well as members from the voluntary sector from some of those key organisations that can help us with our response to be part of that team as part of the pilot. So it's very early days, as I've said already. I think we're sort of 4 or 5 weeks in now to that being up and running. But the feedback that we've had, albeit anecdotal at this time, is very positive, and partners are very grateful for a much more simplified structure and understanding exactly who they can go to in order to have things resolved very quickly. So look forward to watching that progress and develop. As I say, we're looking to undertake that benefits analysis and review later in the year. But I think at the moment that is overwhelmingly positive, and I anticipate that will be identified as good practice for us, especially considering the geography of North Yorkshire, and look at how we can then embed that approach across our other commands.
Tom's got a question for you, Lindsay.
Thank you. And it may be part of that benefits review that you talk about. In terms of the training, obviously the proof is often in the pudding, and how well things actually get dealt with. But will you be doing any testing of the ongoing embedding of that knowledge and skills in terms of the attitudinal and behavioural change of officers, and their ability to recall their training under the pressure of live investigations and live incidents, so that we can be assured that that training has actually taken hold and is being applied properly? Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, Tom. My understanding is that will form part of the benefits review in terms of the approach for that team. But also that's been followed through by some of the work from the quality assurance team. So we've touched on already the quality of the PPNs. Some of those will already come from the expedite team. So it's just understanding where we've given officers that enhanced training that should shine through on the submissions that are made. And Tracy, who is undertaking that on a weekly basis, is looking at, are there any particular trends for certain areas? So I would expect from the positive feedback to see a trend there that those that have had that enhanced training should be submitting PPNs of the best quality, and it's just addressing that with line management, if not, or similarly giving praise. So yes, through some of our weekly checks and balances, we're able to test that. Through the planned audit for the quality assurance team through the year, we've got an opportunity to test that, and then through the benefits review. But I think the feedback from the officers that have received the training so far is that it's been absolutely fantastic in helping them to understand why these children are victims, and actually some of the signs to look for. So we've had some really positive feedback from those that have had the inputs, and looking at opportunities as to how we then expand that across the front line.
And if I may just come in, sorry, Tom, Lindsay, if I may just come in just across that. I think Lindsay also mentioned the national training that we're getting from Operation Hydrant. So from a national point of view, I'm a national lead for group-based CSE, so it's an area of a particular passion and interest. One of the things that we want to do and need to do as an organisation is start doing this as part of continuous professional development. So the training days that Lindsay has spoken about with officers, this is not just about specialist officers. This is everybody's business. So whether it's the contact centre operator, the control room, or it's a PCSO or it's a PC. So what we're wanting to do as part of the training days that we've now got into the rota, and our first, obviously Lindsay's mentioned, I think it's 20th of September, is start building themes into our training days around such as vulnerability, how to spot the signs of exploitation, whether it's criminal or whether it's sexual. So these are the things that we are aiming to do. Yes, there will be dip sampling and continuous professional development of officers, but that's going to sit with supervisors, part of individual accountability meetings that we've now brought in. So it's what we would describe the slightly older officers as tray checks. But because we don't have physical trays anymore, it's the accountability meetings going through individuals' workloads, the quality of their work, their investigations that they hold, and things of that nature.
Thanks, Bad. That's really important for us to hear, I think, because yes, it's all very well looking at the work that's coming through, but actually understanding whether officers are retaining that information, that knowledge, and their ability to apply that is really important, because obviously that has been flagged. So that's really good to hear. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so apologies, moving on. So training adjustments have been made to ensure the frontline officers are increasing the amount of intelligence they are putting on niche, and relevant information is recorded about registered sex offenders. So the inspectorate highlighted that they recommend North Yorkshire Police immediately improve the way it manages registered sex offenders. This predominantly related to the system that we use to record that information, which is called the VISA system. And that's a national system that is available to those in key roles, not routinely available to the frontline to access. And what HMIC FRS found within North Yorkshire is that our officers responsible for managing registered sex offenders were routinely updating VISA with a lot of information, but it wasn't necessarily visible to our frontline officers and staff because they use a separate information system. So, for example, if I am a response officer and I go to a job in the middle of the night, I might know there's some information on the VISA system, but I couldn't necessarily access it or understand what that held. So there were some immediate steps that were recommended around double keying, making sure that we put that information onto both systems. And that's the direction that's been given to the offender management unit. So put everything onto VISA, the national system, as you would do normally, but make sure that goes onto NICHE, which is our local intelligence system as well. So that was addressed immediately, and we've done some audit and compliance work to make sure that that is happening. And then also making sure that we have access to VISA out of hours if required. So there is a process in place now with one of our neighbouring forces who do have 24/7 coverage and access to the VISA system. And we've worked with them to design a memorandum of understanding so that should we get an incident involving a registered sex offender and we need to know what's held on VISA, we can access that out of hours using their arrangements. So those steps have been addressed immediately. We've also then worked really hard to share the information and that specialist knowledge held by the offender management teams across with the local commands. So at the moment, we have got representatives from offender management attending the management meetings daily within the command areas to share any updates, changes, persons of interest, wanted persons, for example. And then also that can help them to raise the profile of the unit, but also highlight any high-risk offenders and making sure we've got that two-way communication between the frontline teams and the offender managers and vice versa. So that's going really well. In addition to that, we were commended on the arrangements we had with partners, statutory partners, particularly in relation to the multi-agency safeguarding arrangements. And we are working really closely just to support our frontline in understanding the information intelligence that would be of interest to offender management and trying to increase the number of submissions that they're making while they're out in their neighbourhoods that could help from an offender management perspective, any activity or enforcement activity they may want to drive. So that's a work in progress. But in terms of the immediate steps that were recommended by the inspectorate, they've been taken. And then finally, NYP are reviewing and actioning how to best make sure appropriate adults promptly attend police stations. So HMIC FRS recommended that within 3 months, North Yorkshire Police reviews how it manages the detention of children, and that we should do that jointly with Children's Social Care Services, Youth Offending Services and other partner agencies. So our response to this has not only been a whole organisation response, but also very collaborative in terms of partners that have had a seat at the table at the silver and gold meetings. So the silver meeting, which is chaired by myself, has both directors of Children's Social Care from City of York and North Yorkshire County Council, but also an open seat there for HMI, for the College of Policing, and for any other organisation that we might want to bring in as experts to be able to address particular elements. So the appropriate adult situation at the moment is that is a service that's delivered by North Yorkshire County Council on behalf of North Yorkshire and York. The HMI found some examples of where children had been held in custody for a significant amount of time before an appropriate adult could be provided. So I think there was an example of 22 hours that a child was in custody while we were seeking an appropriate adult. Clearly, that is not a position that any of us want to be in, and it is a statutory responsibility of the local authority to be able to provide that response in a timely manner. So there is a working group looking at this. They are data-led. I think it's really important to say, because these instances are few and far between. This is not a challenge that's happening on a daily basis. So we need to make sure the response that we design is appropriate to the problem that we are trying to solve. So there are a number of solutions that are currently being explored in that partnership forum, which I think is really important, and they are still just analysing some of that data to make sure that the response that is designed and implemented really does address the issues that we are facing. So I'm confident that we're making good progress and that we will have a solution to that particular issue very soon, and be more than happy to bring an update on that issue back into this forum if that would be helpful. I think, Commissioner, that concludes the presentation slide in relation to the updates. I'm happy to take any other questions. Oh, apologies. There's one that's snuck in at the end, just to say that our approach and the learning that we've taken from the child protection inspection has already been embedded into the safeguarding world, and making sure that we are using that learning and that approach into our inspection that we've just had around victim service, and also taking that into our full HEAL inspection at the end of the year. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. You can have a glass of water now. Thank you very much. Mabs, can I bring you in, please?
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner, and thank you, Lindsay. It's just to say, in relation to that final point, I have had a meeting with Stuart Carlton, Director of Children's Services, with regards to the provision that we need to get some support for out-of-hours adult services, appropriate adult provision. I know Lindsay's picked that up through the Safeguarding Board that she's mentioned. The working group has involved staff from the county Children's Services, and I know that report is currently with Stuart for review. We need to see what the position is from that and progress conversations, because that's been, obviously it was a challenge highlighted in the report, and it's still currently a challenge for us in terms of out of hours adult social care provision for appropriate adults in particular.
Mabs, can I ask you a further question on that? Is there a timeline to it?
I'd have to bring Lindsay in. I know the report was sent, the working group has had Stuart's team on it, and now the report is with Stuart for consideration because there's some financial implications for that particular local authority area. So, Lindsay, did we know when Stuart was going to come back with that at all? Sorry to put you on the spot with that.
No, he knows that this needs to be addressed as a priority. That's absolutely clear. I raised it at the Statutory Safeguarding Children's Partnership earlier this week as well, where I presented a very similar presentation to the one I've just delivered, highlighting that area is still a concern. And actually, while our statutory responsibilities at the moment focus on children, that is very shortly to include vulnerable adults. So it's really important that we get that right. And actually, we consider not just the here and now, but also the requirements that are coming. So he knows that's a priority. We've provided all of the data that's been asked for in order for him to make that assessment, and then it will need to follow the governance route through the local authority. But I'm confident that we've had a voice in the design of the solution that would work for us, but we are reliant on their sign-off before that's implemented.
Thank you. Tom.
Thank you. I was going to ask exactly those questions. So that it's really good to hear that answer. My second question, though, is about the way that learning is being taken on board more widely. It's great to hear that it is. I wondered whether you could just give us some examples of how it is being used to ensure that the wider service provision is exemplary, please.
Mabs?
Yeah, if I can just come in. So we're in the process of establishing an organisational learning board. So we're not just looking at obviously learning from the child protection inspection, but broader organisational learning and how do we disseminate that. So whether that feeds into bite-sized videos, whether it feeds into briefing items, whether it's heads of department, or alternatively, which is the important part, it feeds into the continuous professional development of our officers through training. And that will inform training packages. And also from that, what we can do is take good practice from the College of Policing and look to what we may want to do in embedding some of that into the organisation. So what we're trying to get away from is we pick an isolated thing up and then we just disseminate some information. Feedback from officers is, as you can imagine, Tom, with the amount of information they get, they're not receiving it and digesting it in the appropriate way. So we just need to use different ways of doing that. But that's going to be all done through the organisational learning board, which is, it might have already been established. It might be doing Elliot ACC Foskett a disservice. I think he was in the process of establishing it last month, but I don't want to put any money on that if I was to, without being certain.
That's great. So in terms of the recommendations here, where the gaps have been found, those gaps you're saying are going to be picked up and used to assess whether other aspects of the service that North Yorkshire Police provide are making sure that those gaps don't appear in, whether it be other types of investigations or business service. So if maybe the next time that we bring this back, we could have an understanding of how the organisational learning board is taking the understanding that's been derived from this, where the gaps might exist in other areas of provision. That would be really helpful. Thank you.
No, Tom, it's a really good question. I mean, I think what we're keen to do is not do things in isolation. So, for example, when we got the report from the HMI with regards to the NCPI on the 10th of January, we knew we had some issues in relation to investigative standards on broader crime types. So we haven't looked at our approach in isolation around child protection. What we've looked at is, if we were looking at this, what do we need to do to improve other investigations? The 4-step plan that you'll be aware of that we've put into place, we know that is now starting to pay dividends. Investigation standards are being reviewed. They're being progressed in a more timely manner. The standard is starting to increase, but that's at the backdrop of a young workforce with 60% less than 2.5-year service now. So we're mindful of that. Just today, we've been talking about the timeliness about rape investigation at the force performance meeting. So the reviews that have been conducted on rapes over 2 years old, are we satisfied with being progressed? They're at the right stage of investigation, either with CPS or otherwise. So we are applying this at in a consistent manner across the board, across a number of crime types.
Thanks, Mab. That's a really great example of how that learning's been taken. So that's providing great assurance. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. I don't think there's any more questions, but I'd just like to thank you all very much for coming back, doing a 3-month update. What I will ask is you come back in another 3 months and we revisit this again and you give another update too. Thank you very much. Thank you. And thank you, Lindsay, for presenting that. Okay, so up to agenda item 5. North Yorkshire Police performance update. Lindsay, I think we're back to you again.
We are, Commissioner. Just bear with me while I try and share this presentation. And Mr. Hussain, please feel free to chip in because there are some elements here from our force performance meeting this morning. So if I miss anything...
So anybody would have thought we orchestrated it, Lindsay, which we absolutely didn't. But we have had a force performance meeting this morning where we have gone through neighbourhood crime. We have spoken about robbery and burglary in great detail, as well as other elements, as you can imagine, around the National Outcomes Framework.
Well, that's just great timing then. Thank you.
It certainly is. Thank you. So, Commissioner, the pack starts in the usual way with call handling performance, and you can see from slide 1 the average speed of answer for the period. It goes back to 2019. I think to bring it up to the current day, we know that our call handling performance has been unacceptable. I've talked at this meeting previously about some of the structures and support that we've put around that, and despite those measures, we still had a very difficult couple of weeks. In the last 4 weeks or so, we've had some very, very challenging weeks in terms of demand and therefore poor performance in terms of our average speed of answer. So huge thank you to ACC Foskett, who's led some of the response to that while I've been on leave, but that's actually resulted now in 20 police officers and staff being either trained in call handling or redeployed into the force control room because they've previously been trained in call handling or dispatch. So that work has been ongoing in the last 10 days or so. A number of those officers have now been in the control room environment for just over a week. Earlier this week, we saw another 16 officers and staff being trained in being able to handle those calls that are incoming. And really pleased to say that within the last 24 hours, the officers have completed their training and already started to support the shifts within the force control room. And our call handling performance in the last 24 hours has improved significantly and was well under the 10-second target for answering 999 calls. So we know we've got some ongoing challenges around resourcing and recruitment into the control room, which we are progressing at pace. Link it right back to the questions at the start in terms of attrition and people leaving either to become PCSOs or officers or indeed into other roles, making sure that we understand the scale of the attrition and that we are over recruiting to account for that and make sure we are in the best possible position. So the information and data that's shown on that slide doesn't read 100% well. We know that that is still not where it needs to be, and that short-term measure of redeploying officers and staff into the control room has been well received and has already had a positive impact, particularly on our 999 call handling performance. And it is the intention that those resources will remain in the call centre until we are able to recruit and train further intakes. And all of that is planned out, Commissioner. I know we've shared that information across with your office, but we have got that support now from other areas of the business, which is already having some positive impacts.
Lindsay, can I bring in the Chief Constable, Lisa, please?
Thank you, and appreciate, Lindsay. You can't see any hands going up, so thank you, Commissioner, for that. I suppose it's just to add to what Lindsay's saying and I suppose to offer people watching this some assurance that we've had many conversations and as a Commissioner you have continuously asked us for our updates on this performance and scrutinised the actions taken, and several months ago now we had a conversation about physical numbers of people. And I suppose the plans on this are about, we do recognise we need more people because demand has gone up and physical people, we know the formula is reasonably simple in control rooms of the more people you have, the quicker you can answer the telephones. But running alongside that, we have to assess our demand and where that demand is coming from, because you can't just keep feeding increasing demand. There's got to be an element of prevention and how do we make sure the right people are in touch with us at the right times. But I suppose just that reassurance that I personally visited the control room yesterday, and you'll be reassured to know at 3:30 yesterday afternoon, whilst I was physically in the control room, there were no calls waiting on 101, there were no calls waiting on 39s, there was nothing in the queue buster queue. And call handling times from yesterday are 7 seconds to answer a 39s call, and that was a direct result of physically the number of people operating in the room available to take calls. So I personally spoke to those officers and staff who've gone in to help us. Some of them don't want to be moved from their job, and we're very grateful that they are supporting us in this piece of work. But also spoke to the course of people who are training brand new to step into the control room. They're getting first class training we are starting to see that physical increase in staff making a difference. And I know it's not good enough yet, but just to reassure the people watching this that is in train and starting, you can start to feel the difference that's making.
Thank you, Chief Constable Lisa. But I have to say, thank you too for really grasping the nettle on this. We're both really aware that people are just waiting too long to have their phone calls answered. I really appreciate that. I know there's a tremendous amount of work going on behind the scenes, so thank you. And it looks like we're striving in the right direction, which is really good, but it just has to be sustained. Lindsay, can I ask you a question about when the new recruits are coming in? I believe it's September, is that correct?
It is, Commissioner, yes. There's a course plan for September and another one for January, and it's just making sure that we are able to deliver our commitment in terms of the establishment and the number of resources that we have promised the public that we will have in place. We have seen slightly more people leave the call centre environment than we would have anticipated. So again, just making sure that our recruitment plans are still in line with where we need to be.
Thank you.
And I think the other point I would make just in relation to 999, we've hosted a media event today in the control room to highlight some of the inappropriate calls that we continue to receive, which is really disappointing because obviously while staff are employed on those calls, we're not able to get to the public who need us the most. And I think just to give some examples in this forum, we've had telephone calls because a pizza's been delivered and it's cold, because a taxi hasn't turned up, or the most recent one from last week because somebody had a chicken on the doorstep. So we've used this morning's opportunity to highlight they're absolutely not suitable for 999 calls or indeed 101 calls to policing. They're not policing matters, but just to ask the public for their help and support during this time, making sure that that 999 line is clear for genuine emergencies and that we can answer those calls to people who need us the most.
Thank you.
Moving on, non-emergency calls. So again, I would echo some of the comments I've already made, Commissioner, in terms of our average speed of answer. Clearly, our priority and our immediate focus needs to be on 999 because that is our emergency line. But what we have seen by having those additional resources in the control room is very early stages, obviously, but some positive signs in terms of our impact on 101 as well. So really pleased with those initial indications and look forward to monitoring that over the coming weeks and months to track that progress. But we anticipate that the additional resource will mean we are able to answer 101 calls more quickly as well. I know we were asked a question right at the start of this meeting in relation to callback. I've now had it clarified. It's actually if the projected call waiting time is beyond 3 minutes, the caller will be offered callback. So if based on our current demand that day, we anticipate we can answer that call within 3 minutes, the callback facility wouldn't routinely be offered. But anything where we expect people will be waiting 3 minutes or more, that would be when that callback option would kick in. So just to highlight again, there are a number of ways in which people can report. 101 isn't the only option, and now a lot of our services can actually be accessed online if that is suitable to the person that's trying to contact us. So just encourage people to use those options too. This slide shows our response time trends, so we can see the time it takes to deploy to an immediate call for service, and that's separated into immediate urban and immediate rural. So the times for those are indicated in the graph. Similarly, our priority calls, which we strive to attend within the hour. And we can see there that for June, significant increase in the number of priority calls for service, but again, still deploying and attending those within 36 minutes, which is really, really positive. The information at the bottom of that chart shows the incident volume by district, and no significant outliers there. In terms of any changes that we would expect to see, but immediate grade response and priority grade response is depicted. And then just to the right there, looking at our immediate calls for service, broken down into antisocial behaviour, crime or PSW, which is public safety and welfare, so concern for safety, missing people, etc. Total number of calls that we receive, and the average number of officers that we deploy to any of those particular types of incident. And again, that's replicated below for priority calls for service. So immediate, typically 999, ongoing incident, threat to life, for example, priority where we would seek to attend within the hour. And again, just demonstrates the number of resources that we are deploying. Moving on.
Sorry, Lindsay, just on the previous slide, I think it looks to me like the immediate urban and the immediate rural are the wrong way round on that, because I'm pretty sure unless something drastic has happened in the last month, normally it's the other way around in terms of the rural response being slightly longer. So unless you can tell me that something drastic has happened to significantly increase urban response times, I'm going to assume that's probably it's probably just been mislabeled, perhaps.
I think you might be right there, Tom, looking at that one. I'll double check that with the team. Thank you.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Great news for our rural communities if it was that's the case. But
I'll double check. So moving on to the next slide, then this shows the 3-year crime trend, and as we know, overall it's fairly positive, but we do know that there are some particular crime types that are increasing. They are summarised in the bottom left-hand table, and I think, Commissioner, we've talked previously about the headings that are there. There's no significant change in terms of violence against the person being the highest crime category for us, followed by arson and criminal damage, fraud, and then public order. Just summarising that by district, showing that York, as the geographic area, has the highest count. But from a command perspective, we would then obviously couple that with Selby. Scarborough and Rydale is depicted there together, and then everything else would make up the county command. So just to show that the split in terms of the demand across the geographic areas, and no significant change in that particular trend. So this is where please feel free to chip in if I miss anything. But we have this morning had our force performance meeting, which brings together all of the operational heads of function, and they are held to account for the performance of their teams. We have looked at neighbourhood crime this morning as part of our particular pack. So looking at residential burglary, in particular, having a real focus on positive outcome rates and driving that through the teams in terms of prosecutions or otherwise, but making sure that we're demonstrating that we are taking effective action in prosecuting offenders, looking at our average investigation time, and also making sure that we are maximising forensic opportunities and other investigative opportunities to provide the best possible level of service to those that have been the victim of burglary, which is a horrendous crime when it's a residential burglary. So, Sir, anything else from yourself on that one?
Yeah, thank you, Lindsay. If I may, I know Caroline and Tom, you clearly couldn't make the meeting this morning because of police and crime panel, but you'll have access to the pack and you'll be able to see the specific detail. But if I just start with burglary in terms of residential, so we've brought a new process into place in terms of going back to some basics and standards and making sure that them standards, again, are consistent across the organisation. From a very simplistic point of view, that we attend physically all burglaries, unless there's a particular reason why we shouldn't. So burglary residential, which some of that wasn't occurring. We've looked at our approach around the timeliness of that attendance. Once we attend the investigation standard that takes place, who conducts that investigation, the advice that's given. The outcome rates are clearly not where they need to be. We've gone up to Cleveland and other forces because interestingly, other forces were shown slightly better, but when we've dug into it, some of that data that was replicated nationally isn't entirely accurate. However, what we have done is looked at what the best practice is elsewhere. That's been brought in, it's been shared with commanders, it's also been shared with those that are responsible for this particular area of business. We've looked at our intelligence submissions, what we need to do to improve. They're clearly not where they need to be. However, there's also some really good practice. So we had a particular area in York which was suffering from high-powered cars being stolen, whichever Golf R's. There was an operation both from a local policing point of view and a specialist tactics through covert policing, which I won't go on to here. In essence, a number of people have been arrested. The work is ongoing at this moment in time to build the evidential case, and we are very confident we'll get some charges as a result of that because of a covert aspect of that work that's taken place. Similarly for robbery, some of our areas are particularly good around investigating robbery and burglary. If you look at Andrea Kell, who's a superintendent in the coastal area, her approach and her standards around attendance, investigations and outcomes needs to be replicated in the other two commands, which Lindsay is aware of, and we're looking at how do we share that best practice rather than trying to reinvent the wheel. We have gone into this in some detail. A comment was made, do we really need to be sat in a meeting for 3 hours discussing performance? My response to that was absolutely, until the performance improves. And when the performance is fantastic, we'll be there for an hour.
Okay. Glad to hear that, Mabs. Okay, moving on.
Thanks, and I think it's fair to say very similar conversations, Commissioner, this morning in relation to violent crime and vehicle crime, just making sure that we've got that really clear focus on investigative standards and outcomes as well. So unless there's any particular questions on that slide, I'll move on. Okay, this slide summarises crime investigative outcomes. So we've already touched on the fact this is an absolute focus for us as a force at the moment, tracked and driven through the force performance meeting chaired by the DEP. We are also working really hard to understand what our data is telling us. So, for example, the number of crimes awaiting outcome appears to be particularly high, but once we've had a closer look at that data, it's understanding that actually 37% of that is actually relates to cases that are with action fraud, and therefore we're just simply recorded on our system. So when it comes to finalising them, it's further down the priority queue than some of our sexual offences, burglaries, etc. So it's just understanding exactly what that data is. So while that appears to be a particularly high number, understanding that some of that is an administration issue and making sure that we're working through that with the team. We have touched on victim declines to support, currently sitting at 27.64%, making sure we're maximising the opportunity for evidence-led prosecutions, particularly in some of our high-risk domestic abuse cases, for example, and really driving that through our teams. But again, all of that is currently being tracked and progress driven through our force performance meeting. So hopeful that we will see some improvements in the data that's shown on this slide as that meeting and that governance structure becomes embedded. And the bottom part of that slide just shows that we're dealing with some really complex investigations and they can take a significant amount of time to resolve, because there are complex forensic or digital examinations. And again, that will be a theme of one of the future force performance meetings, looking at the performance of our digital forensics unit and also any cultural issues, for example, making sure that we are seizing relevant devices, not necessarily all devices, and streamlining some of those demands on our other departments. And so that features as a future agenda, doesn't it, for force performance?
Tom, can I bring you in?
Thanks, Zoe. Thanks, Lindsay. That's really good to hear, and great that the fraud stuff's been looked at now, because we did flag that in this meeting a while back. The other thing that we flagged at that time, and I just wondered what and obviously it feeds into the point that you've just made. We had seen that there were a couple of violence cases that were still awaiting an outcome that went back a number of years. So just in terms of, and maybe Mabs, it's down to how the force performance meeting will kind of be framed. But what assurance can you provide us as to how the data that you're able to access through that dashboard is actually interrogated in a way which those cases are routinely picked up and identified and the right questions are asked about them, please?
Do you want me to go first, sir?
Yeah, I'm happy for you to take it. Go on, Lindsay.
Thank you. So it's working with our heads of function to understand the data that they need the visibility on. So we have a suite of dashboards available. One of those is a live crime dashboard, and within that details, for example, crimes that might not have an officer in the case allocated, or the length of time that a crime has been under investigation. So while the high-level data will be available at the force performance meeting and questions asked by the DCC of heads of function, I'm sure, as to explain some of those outliers, that would then track through to the quarterly performance meetings chaired by myself or ACC Foskett with the heads of function, making sure that they truly understand the data in relation to their command or business area, and testing that the appropriate measures are in place to ensure that investigation length of time and a whole suite of other things are appropriate, and that they understand some of the data in relation to their area of business. Does that answer your question, Tom?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Can I ask a question, please, and really a request for the next PAM meeting? I was really concerned last PAM meeting about the awaiting outcomes amount, and it's just steadily growing. Would you be able to bring a breakdown, please, of those crimes? Just put them into groups so we can really understand what they are, instead of just putting them, terming as the other incidents or non-crimes, please, because I'd like to understand that further.
Yes, absolutely, Commissioner. We'll bring a summary of that back to next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I will whiz through, but this slide shows the number of Section 136 mental health detentions. Pleasingly, the number of people in custody is minimal. It's 1 for June, and having asked some questions around that particular case, it was because that individual was actually already in custody for some criminal offences, and then detained at 136 and taken to a place of safety, which was the hospital. In relation to the bullet points that we've got there on the slide, I did query the one that starts 9 incidents required police transportation, 0 following risk assessment, because I thought that could be interpreted in one of 2 ways. So just to bring some clarity then, 9 incidents did require police transportation. Of those, 7 were because an ambulance wasn't available within 30 minutes, and we know there are some significant pressures on our colleagues within the ambulance service, but I've raised that strategically with Yaz this morning, just to make sure there is a focus on their responsibilities around transporting people that are in mental health crisis. On one occasion, ambulance refused to convey the individual because they were particularly violent, and on a further log there's no particular information provided, which isn't helpful. But just for reassurance, we have picked that up with Yorkshire Ambulance Service, and while we clearly want to support them while they are in critical incident mode and have got some significant challenges, there are some key responsibilities in relation to mental health crisis and vulnerable people, and they're really keen to work with us on that. So that's our mental health detention data. The next slide covers stop and search by breakdown by ethnicity, and it shows resident versus non-resident. So when we look at our residents, Black, Asian, mixed ethnicity account for 3.42% of those searches where self-defined ethnicity was recorded. So that's where the officer asks the person, and they tell us their ethnicity. White ethnicity accounts for 87.42% of searches. And when we then compare that with non-residents that stopped and searched in our county, Black, Asian, mixed ethnicities account for 18.89% of those searches where the individuals self-define, in comparison to white ethnicity, which was 61.52%. So just a summary at the bottom of that slide, while there appears to be disproportionate stop search numbers based on ethnicity, it's mainly reflected in the stop and search of non-residents, and that higher positive outcome rate for non-residents supports the view that this is intelligence-led and focused on those who come into North Yorkshire to cause harm. So I know that's a topic that we've discussed in this forum previously, and hopefully having that breakdown of resident versus non-resident just provides some further assurance. In terms of our workforce then, PCSO numbers, you will see there are actual versus our budget is lower and not where we would want it to be. I've confirmed this morning that the next PCSO intake is in September of this year, when we are looking to recruit 28. So hopefully that will give some support in terms of our numbers. There's also a further PCSO intake planned for this financial year, and again we are aiming to recruit another 28 PCSOs on that intake, which will get us to our actual budgeted position. We've got a summary there in terms of police staff, specials and volunteers, but I believe those numbers are relatively stable. And similarly, when we look to the police officer information on that chart, the long-term target is the end of this financial year, so that's March 2023. We are seeking to be at 1645 officers, and we are currently at 1611. And I know there is comprehensive recruitment plans in place to make sure that we achieve that target and our uplift target as well around police officer recruitment. Workforce diversity is summarised at the bottom of that slide in terms of ethnicity and also gender. And again, Commissioner, not seeing any significant changes in the figures that are presented there. So I'm hoping to just be able to skip over those ones onto the next slide, if I may. Thank you. So this one just reinforces what I've already said in terms of our police officer actuals, our uplift target, and the projected towards the end of this year. So against a target of 1645 for the end of March, we are currently projecting 1659, so well over our uplift target for 22-23. And again, that just shows a different model there in terms of the composition of our workforce. It's the same information as the previous slide, just shown in a slightly different way. And then that trajectory of our full-time equivalent of budget and budget target. But again, just showing that we are projecting to be well above where we need to be at the end of the year. Next slide just summarises that by PCSO as well. So I've touched on the fact we're looking to have those 2 intakes, and obviously that would then get us where we need to be, or very close to where we need to be in terms of our full, our establishment. The chart at the bottom right just takes into account projected attrition, and we've based that on the attrition rate for the last 3 years average PCSO headcount as well. So just considering that as part of our people planning. And I think finally, sickness and absence. We have seen a spike recently in the number of our workforce that are absent with coronavirus. Seems to be rife in our communities again. So it's no surprise that that's the top absence reason in the last 12 months, followed by cold and flu, migraine and coronavirus symptoms. So very, very similar to the data that we've presented previously here. However, we have seen a reduction in the number of sickness absences in July when compared to June. So some positive news in terms of absence, notwithstanding the fact that we anticipate more people to be off with COVID, because that seems to be a current trend in terms of workforce. And I think, Commissioner, that concludes those slides. So I'll stop sharing. I'm happy to take any questions.
Are there any further questions from anyone? Because we've been asking them as we've been going along, haven't we? No, I don't think so. Thank you so much, Lindsay. You've done a lot of presenting today. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Okay. So moving on to agenda item 6, and that do we have any more questions from the public? And I believe we do. Simon, is it typed up for me to read from, or shall I just read from the chat bar? Okay. Oh, there we go. So this is a follow-up question from Jane from Bentham, and she says, why are you not personally apologising to victims of CSA who you knowingly failed using unqualified, untrained officers? I want assurance that the victims will receive a personal apology and no other victim has to go through the living hell of what I know some endured. Chief Constable Lisa, you're going to answer this one.
Thank you, Commissioner. And Jane, firstly, apologies. I think we misinterpreted your original question as why haven't we offered an apology? And indeed, I would reiterate, you're right, the general apology that was given right at the outset and has been done on several occasions, that we are sincerely sorry for those failings of those families and children who we've let down for the reasons set out in the NCPI inspection report. I think what you're actually asking us, have we personally apologised to individual victims and families in those cases where the crime was allocated to an officer that didn't have the requisite skills. So I now understand fully exactly the point that you're making. I don't know whether we have made a personal apology, Jane, to each of those individual victims without going to each of those individual cases. As ACC Butterfield mentioned, those jobs were drawn out by HMIC, those reports were picked up, and we went back to those cases. I do not know, without going back to those individual cases, whether we then apologised during the follow-up to that individual family. What I will undertake to do is to draw on each of those jobs that you're talking about, draw on each of those investigations, and I will ensure that a personal apology is given to those families individually, because I think that's what you're asking for. But please contact us if that isn't the question or the point that you were trying to make. But I will undertake to draw each of those files out and make sure that the individual families and victims are contacted with an apology. Thank you, Jane.
Thanks, Lisa. Thank you very much. Okay, let's go to agenda item 7, any other business, and I don't believe there is anything. I'm just looking around the virtual room. No, there isn't. Okay, so date of the next meeting will be late August, early September. I think we've just got to confirm it. But thank you, everyone who's taken part. Thank you to everybody who's been watching, and thank you for those really good questions too. So I'll close the meeting now. Thank you very much.